Most people watched Subaru fall apart in front of Emilia and called it cringe, a meltdown, the moment the show's hero stopped being likable for a stretch of episodes before redeeming himself. That read gets the emotion right and the mechanism completely wrong. What's actually happening in that scene isn't a boy losing his composure. It's a debt collector who just found out the account he's been quietly running for months has gone unpaid, and the shock on his face isn't heartbreak. It's the specific shock of someone who thought the math was settled. There's a reason that scene works as well as it does, and it's not because Subaru suddenly turns unlikable out of nowhere. It's because everything that produces the outburst has already happened off-page, invisibly, across a version of events Emilia was never shown. He's not arguing with her about something that occurred between them. He's arguing with her about a history only he experienced, built from loops she has no memory of living through, and demanding she honor terms she was never present to agree to. That gap between what he's owed in his own head and what she could possibly know she owes is the entire scene. It just doesn't look like a gap from the outside, because nothing about it gets explained before it detonates. He'd been keeping a ledger the whole time. Nobody told him to. Nobody agreed to the terms. He opened the account himself, made every deposit in secret, and never once checked whether the other party even knew there was a balance owed. Go back to where it actually starts, because the breakdown makes no sense without the bookkeeping that precedes it. Subaru dies for people over and over across the loop, and almost none of them ever find out. That detail gets treated as tragic, the noble sacrifice nobody gets to thank him for. And it is tragic, but tragedy isn't the only thing happening underneath it. Look at what he does with those deaths afterward, in his own head, once the loop resets and the debt technically vanishes for everyone except him. He doesn't let it vanish. He keeps counting. Every unacknowledged death gets filed away as something owed to him personally, a favor extended on credit to people who never signed up for the loan and have no memory of receiving it. There's something almost administrative about how consistently this happens, loop after loop, death after death. Not one dramatic sacrifice he's entitled to feel proud of, but an accumulating pile of transactions nobody else can audit. That's what makes it different from ordinary grief over unrecognized effort. Grief fades when the person doing the grieving lets the ledger close. Subaru never lets it close. Each new loop just adds another entry to a running total that only he can see. And the total keeps climbing whether or not anyone around him has any way of knowing it. It helps to notice what the loops actually remove from the equation, because it's not a small thing. In most stories, sacrifice gets its meaning partly from consequence. The person who died stays dead. The debt gets settled by the world itself moving forward changed. Subaru's loops strip that away entirely. The world resets. The people he died for don't carry any memory of the cost. The only place the sacrifice survives at all is inside his own head, which means the only ledger that ever gets to exist is the one he's keeping privately, with no outside auditor, no second party ever able to confirm or dispute a single entry. That's not a minor structural detail. It's the exact condition that lets an emotional debt metastasize into something closer to entitlement, a private accounting system with no external check on it, running for months with only one person ever deciding what counts as owed. By the time he screams at Emilia that she'd be dead without him, that everything he did was for her, he's not describing a feeling in the moment. He's reading a balance sheet out loud, one she's never seen, for debts she never agreed to. That's the part worth sitting with before moving on, because it reframes everything that follows. A person who sacrifices for someone and expects nothing back is doing something close to selfless. A person who sacrifices in secret, keeps score anyway, and then detonates when the secret score doesn't get honored is doing something else entirely, something that looks identical from the outside for as long as nobody asks to see the books. Emilia's answer to him lands as hard as it does, specifically because she's the one person positioned to see the books, in a sense, without ever having read a page of them. She tells him, more or less, that the version of her he's built inside his own head must be remarkable, understanding him perfectly, agreeing him instantly, needing nothing explained. She's not being cruel for the sake of it. She's naming the actual structure of what he's built from outside it in the one sentence that exposes the whole design. He wasn't in a relationship with her. He was in a relationship with a version of her that already owed him everything, built to spec, and the real Emilia kept failing to match the model because the real Emilia was never consulted on the model's construction in the first place. That's a strange kind of accuracy for a character who, by every account inside the story, knows almost nothing about what Subaru has actually been through. He hasn't seen the loops, he doesn't know about the deaths, the resets, the version of him that's died in front of her more times than either of them could count. And yet she diagnoses the mechanism correctly anyway, because she doesn't need the specifics of the ledger to recognize what it feels like to be on the receiving end of one. She can feel the gap between the woman he keeps addressing and the woman actually standing in the room, without knowing exactly how that gap got built. That's not a lucky guess. That's what it's like to be loved as collateral instead of as a person, recognizable from the inside even when the mechanism producing it stays invisible. If the ledger were the whole story, it would already be damning enough. It isn't the whole story. There's a second piece of evidence sitting right next to the breakdown that most viewers file separately as a different kind of embarrassing, when it's actually the same mechanism wearing a different outfit. Subaru stands in front of the royal council and demands to be recognized as Emilia's knight. He has no training, no sword skill worth the name, nothing that would justify the title on merit, and everyone in the room knows it, including him. What he wants isn't a job, it's a rank, a publicly recognized position in her life that can't be revoked the way affection can, that comes with a title people have to say out loud whether or not they mean it. Notice what he doesn't ask for in that scene, because the omission says as much as the request itself. He doesn't ask Emilia whether she wants him as her knight. He doesn't ask the council to evaluate whether he's earned it. He simply demands the label in front of witnesses, as though the demand itself were the qualifying act, as though saying the words in a room full of people who have to write it down somewhere makes the thing true regardless of whether it was ever true to begin with. That's not the behavior of someone seeking approval through merit. It's the behavior of someone who's learned that a title, once granted, doesn't require ongoing proof. Love has to be maintained. A rank just has to be recorded. That's the tell that the ledger isn't really about Emilia specifically, and it's the detail that makes the whole pattern legible as something more specific than heartbreak. A person keeping score out of love wants to be loved back. A person keeping score out of covert narcissism wants a position that guarantees the return, regardless of whether the feeling behind it is real. Status that functions like collateral, locked in, immune to whether the other person actually chooses him. The knight title isn't romance, it's Subaru trying to convert an emotional debt into a structural one, because structural debts don't get renegotiated by someone simply deciding they don't love you back. Here's where the case should start to wobble, and it deserves to, because the counterargument isn't a straw man built to be knocked down easily. Go back further to Arc 2. Subaru throws himself in front of maybeasts to protect village children with no loop to reset the outcome if it goes wrong, no guarantee of survival, no audience keeping score in a way that benefits him afterward. That's not a manipulative bid for status. That's a teenager risking permanent death for kids who can't do anything for him in return. For a while, that scene should feel like it breaks the whole theory. A covert narcissist manufacturing leverage doesn't usually stand in front of a monster for children he barely knows, at the one moment where the debt truly can't be collected. If the thesis can't survive Arc 2, it was never a real pattern. Just a reading imposed backward onto a boy who happened to have one bad night. Push on it further before conceding anything, because the scene earns that much scrutiny. There's no camera crew in that village, no council watching. If the entire pattern were built purely for external validation, this is exactly the kind of moment a pure attention seeker would skip. No one back at the mansion sees this happen in real time. No immediate audience to perform for while it's occurring. That absence should matter. It's the strongest single data point in the boy's favor across either arc. It survives, but only because of what Subaru admits to himself in that exact stretch of story, in the internal monologue running underneath the heroics. He isn't quiet about his own motive, not from himself. He names it directly, in his own head, while he's doing the brave thing. He needs the mansion's residents to see him as useful, as a hero, as someone worth keeping around instead of someone worth discarding the moment he stops being convenient. The mob beasts aren't the real audience for that heroism. Rem is, Ram is, Roswell's household is. He's not risking his life purely for strangers in a village. He's risking it as a performance of value for the people whose approval determines whether he gets to stay in the only life he has left. Real courage and a transaction can occupy the same body at the same moment, and that's exactly what's happening. The children get genuinely saved. Subaru also gets, simultaneously, exactly what he needed, proof on record that he's worth keeping. The absence of an audience in the village doesn't disprove the transaction once you notice where the actual payment gets collected. The debt was never owed by the children, it was owed by the household he'd return to afterward, the one place his survival actually depended on being wanted. The village was never the ledger's counterparty, it was just where the collateral got manufactured, at a safe enough distance that it could look, to everyone, including himself, like it wasn't collateral at all. That's the piece that turns two separate embarrassing scenes into one coherent condition instead of two coincidences. Emotional ledger logic doesn't require the sacrifice to be fake. It only requires the sacrifice to be silently priced, tracked, and eventually called in, sometimes as validation earned through visible heroism, sometimes as debt demanded through invisible martyrdom, always with the same underlying need running the transaction. Covert narcissism doesn't announce itself as narcissism. It shows up dressed as selflessness because self-sacrifice is the one currency that lets a person extract validation without ever having to ask for it directly, without ever risking the vulnerability of a plain request that could just get turned down. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it's the reason this particular pattern is so easy to miss on a first watch and so hard to unsee once it's named. A loud narcissist demands attention directly, and the demand itself is the giveaway. Everyone around him can see the transaction happening in real time. Subaru's version never asks for anything outright. He suffers first, quietly, and lets the suffering do the asking for him. Nobody feels comfortable refusing a boy who just nearly died. That's not an accident of circumstance, it's the entire function of the strategy. Pain becomes leverage precisely because pain is the one currency polite people don't feel allowed to question. And Subaru, whether he's fully aware of it or not, keeps spending it in exactly the rooms where that immunity matters most. Compare the two evidence points side by side, and the shared architecture gets hard to miss. The screaming in Arc 3 is the ledger called in through accusation. You owe me, and you've defaulted. The night demand is the same ledger called in through preemption. Give me the title now so there's nothing left to default on later. One is reactive, one is proactive, and both are reaching for the same outcome, a guarantee that can't be revoked by someone simply changing how they feel about him. That's the through line the fandom kept missing while arguing over whether Subaru was having a bad week or turning into a different character. He wasn't inconsistent, he was running one strategy through two different doors. Which is what makes the pride route the natural endpoint of the logic rather than some detour into a different kind of story. Push the ledger far enough, past the point where any real-world version of this pattern usually gets to go, and you get a hypothetical worth taking seriously precisely because it's hypothetical, freed from every social consequence that keeps the pattern in check anywhere else. In that branch, Subaru doesn't ask Emilia what she wants for her own life. He decides the throne is what she's owed, what completes the story he's been building around her. And when the kingdom itself becomes an obstacle to that outcome, he burns it rather than let her choose something smaller and quieter instead. That's not protection. Protection responds to what the other person actually wants. This responds to what the ledger says she owes him in narrative terms, the hero's payoff, delivered whether or not she ever asked for it, whether or not it's the life she'd have picked for herself. What makes that branch worth treating as evidence rather than just spectacle is what it removes. No counsel to perform for, no household watching to decide whether he's worth keeping, no version of Emilia in the room to contradict the model he's built of her. It's the ledger running with every check on it removed at once, which is exactly why it escalates all the way to a burning kingdom instead of stopping at a title or a shouted accusation. Remove the audience that usually keeps the transaction disguised as heroism, and what's left underneath isn't restraint. It's the same demand, scaled up to the size of whatever's left standing in its way. Strip away the crown and the flames, and it's the exact same shape as the screaming match in Arc 3, just scaled up until there's nothing left to hide it inside. In the mansion, the unpaid debt is a night of silence he can't stand. On the pride route, the unpaid debt is an entire kingdom's worth of a future he's decided she has to accept because he decided she owes it to the version of the story where he's the hero who earned it for her. That's the shift worth actually sitting with once the ledger's visible. It was never really about whether Subaru loved Emilia. He probably did, in whatever way the pattern allowed him access to it. It's that the love kept arriving with an invoice attached, itemized in his head alone, due on a schedule only he had ever agreed to, and the moment she didn't know she owed anything, the whole thing stopped looking like love and started looking exactly like what it always was underneath it. Go back to the word people reached for first watching that breakdown the first time through: cringe. It's not the wrong word so much as the wrong target. What made the scene hard to watch was never a boy embarrassing himself in front of a girl he liked. It was a transaction failing in real time, in public, in front of an audience that had no idea a transaction had been running the entire show. And some part of every viewer who flinched at that scene was reacting to the accounting becoming visible, not to the heartbreak underneath it. The heartbreak was real, it just wasn't the whole ledger.